watch David Letterman on his evening show, late evening show, and you notice that when people are talking, or even when he's talking, he raises his eyebrows, he grimaces, he smirks. You never really know whether he's sincere. How about Jon Stewart in his Daily Show? The way he talks and rolls his eyes when people come on. Is he skeptical? Is he cynical? Is he sarcastic? Is he even nihilistic? That's modernism. Let me elaborate. When you see a building and it looks like a long rectangle and it doesn't have a pitched roof or it doesn't have adornments on it, that's modernism. If you go to a poetry jam and somebody comes off the street and he just starts spouting things without meter, without rhyme, that's modernism. As I'm looking in this studio and I see chairs, I don't see little eagle feet or bear feet, I don't see ornamentation, I don't see engraving. That's modernism. Let me simplify it a little bit. If you ask me what were my aspirations at 21, and if I were to tell you, I didn't necessarily believe this, but what if I were to tell you, I want to be married by 21, by 25, I want to have 4 children, I want to have a house, I want to provide for my family, I believe in the greater good of the United States, I want to serve my country in any manner I could, I believe in the power of Jesus Christ and the Christian faith, and I want to raise my kids as good Christians, and I hope to live to 80 and save some capital for my children and have them live in my family traditions, the values of my family. I want to make sure that my line does not die out, and I want to make sure that they embody the values not only of my family and my tradition, but of the larger Commonwealth in general. You think I was crazy because no one believes that anymore. Well, the point of it is, for 2,500 years since the rise of the city-state, that was civic militarism, that was civic responsibility, that was family values. Even in the pagan world and in the Christian world, the Roman world, the Byzantine world, early Europe, that was how most people thought their lives should be guided. Sexist, racist, whatever we want to call it, colonial, imperialist, didn't matter. That's generally people believed. They were not ironical, they weren't skeptical, as I said, they weren't nihilistic. What happened? Somewhere in the 19th century, we can pick a date, 1848 if you'd like, 1871 if you would like, 1914 if you would like. On a variety of fronts, the entire principles of classical tradition, Western culture was altered in a way that had never been changed for 2,500 years. And it was multifaceted. As I said, it affected literature, poetry, novels, art, architecture, patriotism, nationalism. 1933, the Oxford Debating Society, by a large margin, voted that nobody at Oxford in that room would participate in another war on behalf of king and country under any circumstances. Now, of course, the problem was in 1933, the Germans who had lost World War I were not as pessimistic as the English school students who had won World War I. They had very different ideas. But nevertheless, this was a reflection that patriotism and nationalism were dead. Let me give you a few more particulars of the modern world, and I think they'll seem very familiar. If we look at art, does anybody know what art is? Well, for 2,500 years, I could simply sum it up as whatever my eye sees, somebody's going to replicate that on canvas or on a ceramic vase, or they're going to carve a statue, but it's going to approximate what my eye sees. In the late 19th century, we had Impressionism, where people said, well, your eye doesn't see happiness, or your eye doesn't see sadness, or it doesn't have impressions. We want to have another fourth dimension to the art. And we had these wonderful Renoir, Van Gogh, Gauguin, Seurat. All of these people were able to bring color alive. It didn't quite match what we saw, but it was still realistic. They still had classical canons of draftsmanship and realism. And they created Impressionism. And then we had Post-Impressionism. And then we started, and then Picasso started out as more of a traditional artist, but pretty soon he was impressionistic in a way that Salvador Dali might be. And by the time of the 1930s and 40s, we were into full-fledged modernism, where there was not necessarily any connection between the canvas, the drawing, the sculpture, and what our eyes saw. It was not just impressionistic, trying to bring in greater emotions to the formula, but it was nihilistic. It rejected the entire canons of art itself. It tried to make a political statement, a social statement, a religious statement. So here we are in the modern world where people will defecate or urinate on a particular icon, and that is supposed to convey a statement. It doesn't necessarily mean that anything we see on a canvas or a visual experience of any kind will approximate reality. The same is true of a novel. There used to be the idea of the Greek novel, the Roman novel, especially the 19th century British novel. There was a protagonist and an antagonist. There was somebody who was basically good and somebody who was trying to thwart him was basically bad. We didn't have the anti-hero of the late 19th century and especially the 20th century novel. Somebody who was a flawed human being and made no claims on moral superiority, but we would identify him because he was all too human, to quote Nietzsche, all too human. He represented the same tensions and struggles in our own life, and he was not a cardboard cutout of virtue, so to speak. And the purpose of the novel was not to enthuse us and not to necessarily even enlighten us or to encourage us to be a better person, as it had been in traditional literature of the West, but to depress us, and maybe in an existential fashion to make us think that we don't really know why we're here or there's no purpose to our existence. If we look at architecture, especially in Germany in the late 19th century and the early 1910s, 1920s, 1930s, but you can see it, the building I am in is a perfect example of modernism. We can call it minimalism. That is, there's not one architectural feature on this building that doesn't serve a purpose. Frank Lloyd Wright sort of gave us the idea that if you don't need something, there's no purpose for it being there, and artistically, it will be a superior experience not to have clutter. We can call it functionalism. But whatever we do call it, the idea of the Supreme Court building or the White House or the Jefferson Memorial is passé. When we have a memorial to the fallen, whether it's a Vietnam memorial or the latest Eisenhower memorial, do not go there and expect to see a realistic or an idealistic artistic impression, sculpture or painting, drawing, or anything of that sort. It's going to make a statement. There's not going to be flutes, there's not going to be columns. And the idea of modernism is we reject the legacy of Greece and Rome, we reject the neoclassical legacy of modern Europe, and we have created something that is simply there. And it's there and it's better because it's minimal. And that's pretty much the way the apartment building looks outside of Rome. The new European Parliament in Strasbourg appears. Modernism is the architecture of the day. Not so for the first 2,500 years of Western culture. If we look at values, take nationalism. With the rise of the nation state in the medieval period, and then it came to full fruition in the 14th, 15th, and 16th century, there came an idea that people who had similar values, similar language, similar ethnic commonalities, they had a sense of purpose, a sense of destiny, a sense that they were a large, so to speak, family unit. Sometimes they went to wars, sometimes they tried to colonialize, but whatever it is, they thought that their society was better than the alternative. Under the tenets of modernism, you could be a communist or a socialist who felt that they were a, quote, citizen of the world. There are people in the United States who believe that their first alliance is to humanity in general. They're a citizen of the United Nations, not necessarily the United States. So the idea of nationalism and patriotism is passé. For 1,000 years, there was the Christian church, either the Orthodox Byzantine Church or the Western Roman Church. And even with the period of the Reformation, 1520 to the present, we had a Protestant partnership. But the idea that there would be wide-scale atheism in the West, large numbers of the population who would profess to be agnostic, was just unheard of for most of Western civilization. Modernism brought in the idea, not only do you not have to be a Catholic or a Protestant, not only can you say you just don't know what's what, but you can openly say that you're atheos. You don't believe in any God at all. And more importantly, you believe that that is a superior way of looking at the world, that you've devoted yourself to logos, to pure reason, partly out of the Enlightenment, but partly in this area of modernism. So whether we're looking at nationalism, religion, architecture, poetry, novels, art, popular culture, the way we live today. If you see somebody who's worth $1 billion and you see somebody who's worth $10, there's no guarantee they won't both have Levi's and flip-flops on. There's no guarantee that their patois, their accentuation, will not be identical. There's no way that the visible appearance, the superficial appearance of people in the street gives any indication on who their parents were, how well educated they are, where they live, whether they live in South Central Los Angeles or they live in Palos Verdes. You have no ability to ascertain that distinction. That was not true for most of Western civilization. There was a notion of hierarchy and aristocracy, and then eventually a middle class and a poor class. And it was separated by everything from manners to the way people talked to the way they wore clothes. That is gone. Modernism says in fashion, modernism says in speech, modernism says in music, that there are no longer any distinction. And to the degree that there are distinctions, that we turn our nose up on symphony and opera. Most people do not listen to opera, they do not listen to symphony. So modernism got rid of at least superficial class distinctions. What happened? Why did we go from the Greek city-state of the 8th century BC, pretty much with the same assumptions all the way until 1860, 1870, and then the entire Western tradition was stopped, and it started to pursue a very different course of events that leads us today? One of the obvious reasons was the Industrial Revolution. It started as early as the 18th century with steam engines and pumps in England, but it really got into fruition in the early 1800s with the railroad, mass production of looms and fabric, processed foods, iron production, so much so that by 1880, the world simply did not look anything like it had in 1680. Suddenly, people had access to clothes, people had access to processed food, people had access to basic levels of hygiene in some cases. And wealth was starting to be dispersed. A man might not have 10,000 acres inherited from his great-great-great-great-grandfather in England, but he had a steel mill and had made more money in 5 years than that aristocratic family had in 3 centuries. So the class system was confused and was far more complex. And wealth started to be dispersed, and technology started to change. In 1980, you have a box television with 20 channels. We just assume that we're going to have a flat screen television with 500. If we have an iPhone, we think there's going to be an iPhone 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Things get better, things get cheaper because of mass production and high technology that sort of has a life of its own. And that means that the ancient, the medieval, the Renaissance, the world that we knew it, is completely gone. New architectural techniques in construction allow us to build 1,300, 1,500, 1,800 feet tall buildings in a way that was just impossible in the ancient world. That's one thing then, the Industrial Revolution. But the Industrial Revolution wasn't always good. Remember that vast numbers of people moved from the countryside into Liverpool, into Manchester, into Berlin, into Frankfurt, into Chicago. And they gave up what was a brutal rural existence, but at least there were certain things in the rural world. There were living things, there were animals, there was clean air, there was largely clean water. And even if they got a higher wage or they had access to manufactured goods, they were very quickly in coal mines and steel mills, in looms, working at looms, and they did not have the romance, the pristine nature of life as had been in the pre-industrial world. This spawned a lot of romantic movements, pastoral movements where people started to idealize the countryside. But the point is that there was a great dissatisfaction with what the Industrial Revolution had brought. And so there was a skepticism about progress. There was an anger about progress. And so today we're very confused. We love natural gas in our homes. We like oil in our cars. We all aspire to have a Lexus. But then we have the luxury, because of the Industrial Revolution, to, along with Al Gore, say, well, we don't really need oil. We could use windmills, or we could have solar panels. So the idea of industrial progress is ambiguous because we have romanticized our pre-modern selves. That confusion also contributed to the rise of modernism. There was another reason. The 1860s, with the unification of Germany, we had the first great industrial war following the American Civil War, and that was the Franco-Prussian War, where people for the first time in Europe had sophisticated cartridge weapons, mini balls, artillery, and were able to kill large numbers of people, far in excess to what Napoleon had been able to do 75 years earlier. I'll give you one example. In 1862 at the Battle of Shiloh, more Americans, both Confederates and Northerners, were casualties, wounded, missing, or killed, than all of America's wars back to the Revolutionary period in one battle. And we had Antietam and Gettysburg on the horizon. So war was very different. And of course, the great landmark period, watershed in European history, was that awful death camps of 1914 to 1918. I say death camps, that was essentially the trenches from Switzerland to the Baltic Sea. 8 million people got killed for what? For Franz Joseph's dream, Kaiser Wilhelm, King of England, David Lloyd George, Woodrow Wilson, 14 points. Nobody knew. And there became a great skepticism and anger. And people said, why, with all this sophisticated technology, are we spending it on artillery that can shoot 30 miles? Or why are we trying to use locomotives to bring poison gas to the front? So there was a disenchantment. And out of that, previous 19th century movements, Marxist, communism, socialism, existentialism grew up as an anger at what a complex modern life had become, because it was amoral. Nobody in the ancient world was able to kill 8 million. And when you add on World War II and 50 million, then we can see why modernism is firmly entrenched. It's a skepticism, it's an unhappiness, it's a disassociation with the tenets of progress, of religion, of nationalism, of the course of Western civilization because of the great losses and confusion. So much today that if you say that you're going to remove a dictator who's killed 1 million people, Saddam Hussein, and you're going to try to implement consensual government, you may lose 4,000 Westerners in the process. Somebody will say to you, it's for oil, even though the U.S. oil companies did not plan, nor have they ever taken one drop of Iraqi oil, because we're skeptical of Vietnam and Korea and the cost of World War II and World War I, and we know what the industrial world can do when unleashed on the battlefield. Religion is a problem too, isn't it? With greater affluence and leisure, it's hard necessarily to accept some of the tenets of Christianity that say that poverty is noble, that the person who's poor and impoverished and lives a virtuous life may get to heaven in a way that the rich man has far more difficulties at achieving paradise. And so we sort of had the idea that Christianity didn't speak to us in an urbanized or suburbanized, highly sophisticated, highly affluent world. But modernism wasn't just created by these larger trends of the Industrial Revolution or urbanization or the squalor of the factory or the carnage of the war or adjusting to the new affluence. There were also people who made it possible. One of them was Charles Darwin, another was Friedrich Nietzsche, Karl Marx, Sigmund Freud. Let me just review what their contribution were. Darwin told us that we were not divinely inspired, that life didn't begin 5,000 years ago on the planet. In fact, under the evolutionary process, we were no better than apes. Once you implant that into the collective mindset and you believe that you're not special, that your fingers or your eyes are not created in God's image, but no different than the baboon, and they're functional, and they can become vestigial, and you will die just as they have, then the uniqueness of the human species was lost, and religion itself was questioned. We became advocates of proof. No longer was faith reserved for that 10% of experience that didn't have to follow logic, but we said to it, if you can't show me a material God, why should I reject the science of evolution? Freud then came, 19th century, and he said to us, what you say is not what you really mean. There's everything from an Oedipus complex to being polymorphous, perverse, but you have inner drives. When you were suckling with your mother, you developed ambiguous relationships with your mother. When you dream at night, it's not the old classical idea that those are the false parts of life and they only come alive when you're actually doing them in the day. No, those represent repression. And so when John Stewart is smirking, we say there must be something going on. A classical historian would have said Napoleon, he failed at Waterloo because he didn't have good tactics, or he had flawed strategic ambitions in Russia. A Freudian might say, well, you know, he was short. And he had all sorts of inner angst and insecurity. So when we see somebody today and he is taking drugs and he's using alcohol, The classical mind for 2,500 years say he has a deficit in character, or he has not accepted the Word of God and he wasn't given divine inspiration, or he's just a bad seed, or he's no damn good. The modernist says, let's look at what his father was like. Let's see if his mother was cruel to him. Let's see if he had sibling rivalry. Let me see if all of these inner angst. Nietzsche comes along, he says, you know what? Religion and most public morality and the status quo are usually constructs that the masses make to harness the aristocratic Übermenschen. In other words, religion is a sham, civic morality is a sham. It's just things that we do to mask what we really are. It really turned philosophy from the Socratic idea of finding the abstract and internal and absolute good into a relativistic process, where if somebody says, I'm good, or I'm noble, or she's virtuous, or she's somebody we should emulate, you say to yourself, well, you say that because you're inferior to them, or you're trying to shackle them, or you have sort of a feeling of inadequacy. And taking this Platonic idea that most of human experience is to try to get the Steppenwolf among us, or the Zarathustra, or whoever he is, the Übermenschen, and try to harness him, was a very destructive concept to the idea of virtue and classical ethics. There was a fourth luminary in the modernist movement, and that was Karl Marx, of course, with Das Kapital and the Communist Manifesto in the mid-19th century. Coming out of the revolutions of 1848, he suggested that all of history could be seen as what? Class struggle. The efforts of the aristocratic, wealthy capitalist class to harness and to exploit and to destroy or use or manipulate the proletariat or the working class. You are now looking at a society on class distinctions. Or if you see somebody and we say to, in this popular modernist refrain, we need more food stamps, we need more Section 8 housing, we need more health care. It is almost treasonous in a country in the West today to say, well, wait a minute. For whom? For Mr. Smith, who stays home and drinks? For Mr. Wilson, who doesn't get a job? You can't say that because they're part of a collective anonymous class that's being exploited. That is a chief tenet of Marxism. It's modernism due to Mr. Marx. So Marx or Freud or Darwin or Nietzsche, they were the personification of these wider trends that changed forever Western civilization. Where does it end? Where do we go after modernism? You tell me, because once you've destroyed rhyme and meter in poetry, or a protagonist in novels, or bead and reel ornamentation and molding in architecture, or a belief in God, and you're the antithesis to all that, it gets pretty boring. There has to be an antithesis to the antithesis, and that's where we're headed, which is nihilism or anarchy, the postmodern, after modernism, that says to the painter, I don't need to react to classicism. I don't need to do any of that. I need to react to you. So you take a piece of paper and you throw colors on it and you think that's modern. I say it's not even modern at all. I urinate on the wall and take that because I question your very genre of having a painting. I'm going to make a pyramid and put it in front of the Louvre because I don't believe in right angles. And that's where we are today. What's the future? All of us, I think, in the dark hearts of us all hope that when you go from classicism to modernism to postmodernism so quickly within the space of 2 centuries, that we're poised for a rebirth for something real again, which would be the first 2,500 years of Western civilization.